Hello and welcome to another edition of the Knicks Film School pregame show. My name is Andrew Claudio, aka GMAC, and it's time to preview another Knicks matchup, this time on Monday night against the Detroit Pistons. We had a fun time against all these teams that will be making the playoffs and potentially be playing the Knicks in this upcoming April tournament that we're all hoping the Knicks are healthy for. And as much as I want to say we get a reprieve against the 8-48 Detroit Pistons, we have seen the Knicks not only play down to opponents in the past, but recently we've seen the Detroit Pistons put scares into some teams. In fact, we're recording this less than 24 hours after the Pistons gave the Orlando Magic, who are 3-0 against the Knicks this year, a bit of a scare. So we'll see how the Knicks do against Evan Fournier and Quentin Grimes and a couple of former Knicks coming into the Garden on Monday night. And joining me to talk about this matchup and preview this game from the Detroit Free Press and co-host of the Pistons Pulse podcast, Mr. Omari Sankofa. Omari, thank you for joining me today.
Andrew, thank you so much for having me on.
So let's start here. The trade that happened a little over 2 weeks ago, I guess 3 weeks ago, that sent Bogey and Alec Burks to the New York Knicks for Quentin Grimes, Evan Fournier, and Ryan Arcidiacono, and I believe a couple of second-round picks. What was the mood in the locker room? Because I'll get to some vibes in Detroit, but obviously the Knicks connection we want to focus on first. But the vibe around the franchise that, after a little over a year of like what you can get for Bogey, how much of an asset is Alec Burks? When the trade actually went down, what was the reaction?
It was interesting because the Pistons had a 5-game West Coast trip going against the All-Star break that took them through the deadline as well. So it was just kind of odd to be in Portland and you go into the locker room and those guys hadn't even come in yet. There's I think the Pistons had 8 or 9 guys, and they're all young. I think for Detroit, you have 2 guys like Alec Burks and Boyan, who, of course, were putting up points here, but at the same time, we're not necessarily moving the needle as far as wins. It seemed like they would move them at some point. It just wasn't necessarily clear when that would take place because they had aspirations to be a competitive team this season. And, of course, that did not happen. Troy actually acknowledged when he talked about the trades to the media after the deadline that, if they had moved Bogey a year ago, they probably would have gotten a bigger return for him. But even so, to get a guy, Quentin Grimes, and a couple second-round picks, I think especially to get Grimes, who I guess if you look at it from a value standpoint of if you get a first-round pick and that pick is in the 20 through 30 range, if you got a Quentin Grimes like player with it, you probably feel pretty good, right? So to get a guy in Quentin Grimes who could come in immediately and fill a void as a perimeter defender, 3-point shooter. He actually just made his debut last night because, of course, he had the right knee sprain that had held him out pretty much through all of February until last night. But that was the highlight of the package for them. And, you could probably feel 2 things at once, right? In hindsight, maybe you make this type of move sooner if you know what the season is going to be. But of course, you don't know that. So, I think they still feel pretty good about what they ended up with. And then with 26 games left, Quentin obviously having some rest to work off. I think he only shot 2 for 8 last night, but the defense was still there. The playmaking was there. It's just more of an evaluation at this point to, figure out, do you extend Quentin this offseason or, do you wait to restricted free agency? But they do see him as a long-term piece.
So there's 2 things at play here that I find somewhat fascinating. The first thing is that the 2 trades the Knicks have made, neither team on the opposite end has cared about this upcoming draft. The Knicks have 2 picks coming up in this draft. They have their own pick and they have the Dallas pick left over from the Porzingis trade. And in both cases, the Raptors were like, we prioritize Emmanuel Quickley as a future piece. Give us RJ Barrett. We'll work with him. And the Knicks didn't have to give up a first-round pick in that deal. In fact, the pick they gave up was Detroit's pick that is the second-round pick, which will probably end up being the 31st pick. But the evaluation of the upcoming draft class has forced the Knicks in these 2 trades to be able to make these types of moves to upgrade their roster, but not necessarily, get rid of their draft capital that they've built up to somewhat of a treasure chest. So that's been fascinating. The Pistons seem to have the exact same evaluation where we heard for years what OG Anunoby would be worth, and it's how many picks, and it ends up being no firsts. And in with the Pistons, it seems like they could have had a similar package if they had pulled the trigger earlier, and it ends up being no first. And to the Quentin Grimes of it all, just like the Raptors, the Pistons seem to have prioritized, like, we'd rather have a guy. Like when I had Bryce on, your co-host, back a couple months ago, he was like, the Pistons seem to have enough, like, guys they've drafted that they want to take chances on. They're not looking for like future picks to potentially, take swings in the draft. We'd rather have like somebody that's developed like Grimes. With Cade already in the build, obviously, like the cornerstone and what the franchise is building around, and Ivy already in the mix, like, where does Grimes factor in? Do they see him as like a potential starter? Does he like a sixth man? Is it just like we have a rotation piece that's part of the solution? How much of an evaluation is there? Or is that more of like a wait and see as you get him in your building?
There's some wait and see to that, but I think they see him as a bona fide rotation player, which, for a team that had 2 wins coming into the new year and they have 8 now, but, you're still essentially competing to not be the worst Pistons team of all time at this point. Just getting rotation guys is a win for this squad. You look at where their team was at the beginning of the year. They really had very little shooting, had very little real playmaking outside of the guard positions, outside of Durant, who's been, pretty solid passing it this year. But they just needed guys who could come in and just hit shots and defend, and that's really it. They didn't really have a lot of true 3-and-D wings on the roster. And I think a lot of the plan was just to hope that guys like Jaden Ivey and, Asar Thompson, Sasser, like they added them in the draft last year, but the guys would come in and develop into some of those roles real quick. But what ended up happening is that you had a roster of guys who could either shoot or defend, but not both. And you were just giving a lot up. So just to get a guy, Quentin Grimes, who you feel pretty good. He could play next to Cade. He could play next to Ivy. He could play next to Sasser. It's not a whole lot of lineups he doesn't fit in, especially when you have some bigger guards like Cade and Ivy and then Grimes at 6'4". You really don't have to hide as much. The only situation you would is if you have Sasser out there who's 6'2", 6'3". But yeah, I mean, Grimes, a career 37.9% shooter. You all saw in New York, just how much of a dog he could be on defense. The Pistons just need bricks to kind of set this foundation, and he's one of those guys. If he becomes a starter, like, by all means, great. But, I think it was just more so, let's get some NBA players in the building.
Look, I'll say this as someone who obviously saw every minute of his NBA career here in New York. The franchise trajectory when he replaced Evan Fournier in the starting rotation it just kept going upward last year. And, there's some point of attack questions, I guess you could have, because he's 6'4". And the evaluation I think one of us had made last year was, if he's 6'8", 6'9", we're talking about him like Paul George, like Kawhi Leonard. Well, not in the sense of like all-star or anything like that, but his defense can be that impactful. But because he's 6'4" and you're asking him to guard the point of attack, there's some limitations that exist there, but his screen navigation is elite. His off-ball defense, it's when him and Manuel quickly would be on the court together. It was it's very telling when the Knicks had their best unit defensively on the floor. And even after the trade, seeing when he'd played next to OG, seeing when he'd played next to Josh Hart. I understand why the Knicks made the trade, but I'll definitely be curious to see what he becomes in Detroit and with his career going forward. You mentioned that the Pistons are curious, are trying not to become the worst. This year's team is trying not to have the worst record in Pistons history. So just like, how are the vibes? Like, it's kind of weird to say this because, like you said, they are 8-48, but they had 2 wins going into the new year, and it's like a legitimate statement to say they've played better lately. They're 5-14 in their last 19. Like, that is an improvement over the I guess, what was it, 2-30 or something, or 3-33 at one point that they were.
Yeah, they started off 2-29.
Okay, so in that sense, like, how are the vibes? Is there like, okay, it definitely wasn't that bad. It's bad. Like, You tell me, like, how are people evaluating this season so far?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's going maybe from more of a sense of like a helplessness, like when you're mired in a 28-game losing streak, and especially the whiplash aspect of it, where week one, you go down to the wire with Miami, and then you beat Chicago, and then you beat Charlotte, and you're playing good defense, and it's, like we might actually be decent this year. And then like to lose 28 straight, which of course tied the all-time record, was something that I don't think anybody could really prepare for or plan for. Like, that's obviously not a part of any rebuild plan, but especially when you're in year 4 and you pinpoint this season as a leap forward, and the opposite happens. You take a pretty significant step back, even from last year, and they only won 17 games last year. So I would say that the vibes now are better, just from the standpoint of you're not walking into the locker room and you just feel this palpable, just like weight on the players' shoulders, on the coaching staff shoulders. Like, how do we get out of this rut that we're in? You're past that. They actually began to get better in January when they traded Isaiah Livers and Marvin Bagley to the Wizards. And then they got Danilo Gallinari, who they ended up buying out, but then Mike Muscala, who can space the floor. And I think he probably fits Monty's scheme a little bit better. And his roster, too, just has a veteran who, knows where to be on defense. He's not a great defender, but, he knows where to be, does small stuff, and he can knock down threes. I think they won like 4 of 9, something like that, when Muscala first came in. And that was just, pieces fitting together better. There was a positional overlap with Wiseman and Bagley and Duran. And then you sort of add to that, now you have Fontecchio, you have Grimes. And the last 2 weeks have just been so haphazard, just with the West Coast swing and all of that. But, I think that there is hope that, once these guys get settled, that you could kind of get back to where you were in January. So the vibes are better. I would say the vibes are more so, let's try to finish the season with momentum. Let's see if we can continue this thread we've been on since the new year, where we're competing more, right? Like, I know that there was a graphic I saw on social media the other week where, the Bucks and Pistons at that point had the same record in like the last 30 days, which speaks more to how much the Bucks have struggled. But again,
I was gonna say,
the Bucks aren't historically bad in that stretch. They're just regular bad, and the Pistons are regular bad in that stretch. So like, that's not good, but compared to where you were 2 months ago, it is better.
I was gonna say, like you said, it's better. It's an improvement. If you go from historically bad to just regular bad, that is on a trajectory that is up. So
it doesn't feel like a win, but it's like, okay, at least we got the monkey off our back, so now we can evaluate what to do next, right?
I'm gonna say, avoiding historically bad is sometimes all you need. I'm sure, I can't believe I was about to make a Jets comment. I'm a Jets fan, and I was like, a couple of years ago, they were 0-14 through 14 games. And I was like, hey, just avoid being like 0-18 and 0-17, you'll be okay. And I'm realizing, I had a moment of self-awareness. Oh my gosh, I'm talking to someone from Detroit who has the Lions, who went 0-16. And it's like, oh yeah, that's why Matthew Stafford ended up in Detroit. Just avoiding the historically bad is sometimes enough. To your point about Mike Muscala, in 165 minutes with the Pistons so far, he is a plus 18, which is the 99th percentile according to Clean the Glass. In those possessions, the Pistons, when he's on the court, are plus 10 on offense, and they're outscoring their opponents by outscoring on offense a plus 10, and then a minus 7.9 on defense. So he's when he's on the floor, they're a pretty good team. But granted, it's a small sample size for sure. But like you said, to your point, getting more NBA players in there, or rotation players in there that are, potentially veterans that could contribute to winning, might lead to the uptick from historically bad to just bad. I wonder about the wear and tear that can have emotionally, all the losing. Like, one thing I noticed during the losing streak was Cade, and like the reactions at the end of games, where you could see like he just wanted this losing streak to be over, this whole thing that, like, year 3 of his career, I'm sure he didn't expect this to be part of the narrative. In your interactions with him in the locker room and covering him this season, how is he taking the fact that, like, in year 3, the team may be taking a step backwards while he's personally, from what I've seen, taking a step forward? How is he really dealt with that?
I think there's probably a mix of emotions for Cade. Obviously, not any really positive, just given the state that the team is in right now. But, for him, there's an element of he missed most of last season, and now he's back and he's playing at a high level. And, it's probably just some personal appreciation and just that you're able to resume your career after, the injury he had and, sort of get things back on the pace he was previously. But, of course, that's overshadowed pretty significantly by the fact that the team expected to be better this year. And then, of course, they've taken this big step back. I don't want to say it's been humbling. Like, I don't think they needed to be humbled. They hadn't won anything. I think they understood, like, we're a young team and we have to, prove that we can win. But, it's probably been like an ice bath or like, just some cold water, right? Like you have all this momentum over the offseason, like new coach, like you bring in new players, you have a healthy summer if you're Cade and you're in the gym, like you're doing Rico Hines with Ivy and Duran and the other guys. And it's like, like it's our turn. And then, you come in and you take a step back from last season, which already was not a good season. It's definitely a pretty cold, dose of water, right? I think you probably have a better appreciation for just how competitive the NBA is, especially now. Like, it just seems like the NBA, especially in the West, it just seems like the gap between the top teams and the mid-tier becomes a little bit smaller every year. And you look at the bottom and it's really just 5 teams this year, right? Like you have the Pistons, you have the Wizards, you have the Spurs, you have the Hornets, and then maybe Portland, who have all just sort of not really been in the mix from the start, but it's 5 teams in a 30-team league, right? So, I think the Pistons, the spotlight's been on them more because of the 28-game losing streak, but you have the Spurs who have also had a really long losing streak and they're only a game or two better. And the Pistons may not even be the worst team this season, right? So it's interesting because it's like, yeah, this is not a good season. And like we are realizing that, yeah, we have a long way to go to get to that next step. But I think with that, just to improve over the last 6 months and, now it kind of gives you a sense of, okay, now we know what we need to do this offseason. I think the front office has probably much more significant questions to answer, and figure out. But just from a player standpoint, it's, yeah, this sucks. This is terrible, but we're getting better. And maybe that gives you a little bit more, I don't want to say drive, but now you understand that, if you're not past a certain threshold, like you're going to get beat every single night. So there's just a certain baseline you have to hit just to be competitive in today's league now.
So you mentioned the team has improved their morale in going from like historically bad to just regular bad, right? And getting out of helplessness amongst the team, obviously, I'm sure from the front office perspective, just from a franchise perspective, that's good. If I can ask you the temperature of the fan base a bit, like you have, like, in my opinion, a big 4 in Cade and Ivy and Duran and Thompson, right? And obviously a top 5 pick incoming. The vibes amongst the fan base, if you had to take a mood, like it's year 1 of a new head coach and everything started off rocky, but as the team has gone from it's better, like the vibes are better, is the fan base like, are they running out of patience at all that this rebuild is taking longer than expected? Or is there, because there's no weight of expectations? Or I guess actually that's a follow-up question. What were the expectations coming into this year? And now that they are what they are, like what's the vibe amongst the fan base?
Yeah, the expectation was just really to take a pretty significant step forward where maybe you could be this year's version of what the Magic were last year or what the Pacers were last year, where you're still maybe a bad team, quote unquote, but you're clearly on an upward trajectory and you see a very clear path for the team to be more competitive a season later and maybe push for a play-in or playoff spot, which, the Magic and Indiana are both in that category now. And they've got guys like Paolo and Tyrese Haliburton who are very obvious up-and-coming stars. And, you're the Pistons, like Kay is healthy after missing all but 12 games last year. I think they expected a step forward, whether that's from going to 17 wins to 30, 32, to like you expect some sort of measurable progress where at the end of this season, even if you don't make the playoffs, you could say we're right where we need to be. And now we have this cap space we could go and spend. And we feel pretty good that next year we will be a competitive team. So that was an expectation, I think, for the front office and for the fan base. And I would say now that you're sort of like 2 2/3 of the way through the season. And, it's just very clear that this is going to be a step back. Like, even if you win some more games down the stretch, you're just fighting to get back to the 17 you were at last year. I would say fans are just tired. They're tired. They're weary. It's been a very long rebuild. Like, you're in year 4 of the current iteration, but you even go back before that. Like, I turned 30 this year, and they haven't won a playoff game since I was in 8th grade. Like, that was 2008, right? Like, that was when they traded Chauncey. They've had a couple playoff appearances in that stretch, but they have not won a playoff game. Like, they've only been swept to the first round. And that's like, it's just weird now. Like, I have people in my mentions who are like in college, right? Like, like 19, 20, 21 years old. And I'm like, okay, well, if I turn 30 in a couple of months and they're like 9, 10 years younger than me, then they haven't seen a playoff win. Like, they probably cannot remember a playoff win. Like, they were like 6 or 7 years old when it's happened. So, for the Pistons to finally do this the right way, like, you tank, you get Cade, you get like some top 5 picks, you get some guys who seem like they have star power and can turn this thing around, and only to have the worst season in franchise history and lose 28 straight. Like, this is just a complete disaster season, probably worse than anybody could have reasonably imagined or predicted. Even the most skeptical Pistons fans probably would not have predicted like historically bad this year. So it's just, like, it's a pretty bleak place. Like, I think people have been sort of fed up with just the state of the team for a while. And then this season, when all the signs say we're taking a step forward and you take this massive step back, like, I think people are at their wits' end. So, I don't know what that means for the future. Like, they're still getting good attendance at the games and this and that. But yeah, I think the fans are kind of going through it this season, and it's pretty understandable why.
I hope this is coming from a place of respect when I ask this, but like, or more necessarily like a thing I want to say to Knicks fans watching this. Like, when you hear that I'm talking to someone who covers a team and has been following a team that hasn't won a playoff game since 2008, and the things we complain about are just so small and very much quibbles. And like, I think that perspective, I think, is necessary sometimes when you get to the other side of a long drought like that. Like, the Knicks didn't make the second round, or made the second round once this century. And it was 2013 with that Melo team. And then last year they made it again. And it was, people couldn't understand why we were celebrating the way we were. And, I can appreciate, because of just the teams that I root for have all gone through some dry spells. Like, I empathized and like understood when the Timberwolves reacted the way they did about the play-in game, like that play-in win, it became a meme, right? When the Lions this January, like last month, I'm not sure how fresh that wound still is, but
it's not even, for me, it's barely even a wound, because I never thought that they would go that far. So that's perspective. Yeah.
Like, I watched when they won against the Rams, and I understood, like, hey, they haven't won a playoff game since I was 3 years old.
Yeah.
And this is like the first, like, I'm going to be 36 this year. So that's the perspective, I think, that Knicks fans, when we quibble about Tibbs or Bogey or whoever, that we're upset with. And my gosh, are they going in on Alec Burks at the moment? He has not looked the best since joining the Knicks. I don't know how much of the Knicks you've had a chance to watch, or what the two former Pistons have done in Knicks uniforms. But if I could just like hand the show over to you, if you have any thoughts about what the Knicks have done this season with their roster and where they rank amongst the hierarchy of the East, and what these two guys may potentially add to their team, I'd love to hear them.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think just to watch from afar, just the way the Knicks have been able to get this thing back on the right track. Like, it wasn't that long ago that people were having questions about Julius Randle and his ability to be the guy and whatnot, and then you have Jalen Brunson, who just kind of steps in and becomes like arguably the best point guard in the Eastern Conference this season, or at the very least clearly top 3. And you just have you've stacked moves together that have worked out. And, like, I remember the Carmelo, like Omari Sankofa Knicks teams, like, I've seen the Knicks put some good teams together, but for them to do it in a much more, like, I don't want to say organic just because they didn't draft these guys, but to actually really pull in free agents who weren't necessarily like the cream of the crop guys, but they come in and they surpass expectations. And you look at the roster, you have depth, like you had OG Anunoby, like you just string these moves together. and they're a genuinely good team now. Like I think that's cool to see just from like an outside perspective. Like personally, my philosophy is always like just to be able to compete year in and year out. You know, I think sometimes fans could take that for granted, as you were kind of touching on earlier, because it could always be worse, right? And at the end of the day, you only have so many teams that are truly elite every year, and it's really tough to break into that category. And for New York to be like the biggest market in America too, and to have those issues, like, you know, I follow a lot of Knicks people on Twitter. I've seen like the Knicks tapes memes and, you know, like this and that. Like I know that things were pretty dire for a while, and now they've really put together a really strong, really deep team. I think that's been cool to see. And Brunson's one of my favorite players to watch because me and him are like pretty much the same height, and I always like watching guys who are built like me out there, you know, have success. So that's been cool. And I like that they just like stuck with it. You know, like they didn't panic trade Randle, like they stuck with it. I actually liked at the time when Minnesota traded for Rudy Gobert, even though they gave up so much, because it was just like, you have a chance to go for it, you got to go for it. And last year didn't work up, and now they're really good. So with that, like Alec Burks, like just looking at his numbers, and like I've seen the Knicks here and there, like it seems like he's pretty much similar to the player he was in Detroit, except the shot isn't falling to the extent that it was. He only shot 39.4% overall for the Pistons this season, though he did also shoot 40% from three, but he had a pretty significant slump early in the year that he broke out of for maybe 4 or 5 weeks before he was traded. And, you know, maybe now he's in a new environment and he's kind of back to that. I mean, I say new environment, but he was in New York a couple of years ago, so it's not a brand new environment. But you know, but he's a guy like he comes off the bench, or he start like regardless, he's either going to shoot you into the game, or you know, he's not going to hit shots. So you're figuring some other stuff out. But he's very much like a hot and cold shooter, and there's going to be nights where he wins you the game. There's going to be the nights where it's okay, like maybe we need to go a different direction tonight. And then Bogey, he's been his usual consistent self. Like he's still shooting the ball really well. Like I see what he's shooting from three. You know, that's pretty similar to what he did in Detroit, you know, except he's now much lower in the pecking order in New York, obviously. Like I see he's taken about 11 shots down from 15, but still a pretty substantial row. You know, like those guys were always great here in Detroit. They were always great to us, the media. Like they were awesome to deal with. And we do miss them in the locker room. Like you don't really have those guys in the locker room now, other than Evan Fournier. And it'll be fun just seeing Knicks fans tweet about them and, you know, see some of the parallels from Pistons Twitter, or something's different. But those guys are, you know, like a little bit older, and they're in a situation where they can compete now. So at the end of the day, it's probably a better situation for them than what they had here in Detroit.
Yeah, I pointed out the last 19 games of Alec Burks, which ironically, I went to the point that the starting point was the day the Knicks traded RJ Barrett and Emmanuel Quickley for OG Anunoby, which I joked around like that was Burks realizing, oh, there's a job audition to be had. Like I may be able to go back to New York and play for a team that's going to make the playoffs this year. Where he, over those 19 games, shot 47% from three on 7 attempts, or 6.5 attempts. And like that, I don't need that version to come back completely. I need like 85% of that version to come back completely, because there's a very clear drop off defensively from going from Grimes to either Bogey or Burks. I'm willing to wait until Anunoby gets back to actually have a full judgment on either of these guys, because they're supposed to be playing in the second unit and like taking advantage of backups, you know, and as a result, they we just haven't seen that version yet, and they're somewhat getting exposed. So we'll see like if the fully realized version of this roster actually shows that their contributions are what they're meant to be in the long run. Last thing before I let you go, I like to end every pregame pod with somewhat of a top 5, make it somewhat evergreen. We were doing a Mount Rushmore of rivals for the longest time. I actually want to pivot to that. I was going to ask you your top 5 for the MVP, but you being a Detroit native, and like I'm assuming you've followed the Pistons your whole life, the Mount Rushmore of rivals is like the 4 teams that you look forward to on the calendar that you consider like, oh, it's Pistons against so-and-so tonight. And I know Bryce didn't have like the extensive history of the Pistons the last time I talked to him. So who would you say are like the 4 teams that Pistons fans still consider? I know it's a 8-48 season, so everybody is kind of their rival, but overall as a franchise, who are the 4 teams you get up for?
Yeah, I would say that those rivals for the Pistons and especially Pistons fans are probably more so rooted in like the historical aspect now rather than maybe recent history.
Right.
Just because,
right.
Again, they haven't been good. I would say beyond the historical part, I would say the teams that like fans probably wake up for now. The top of that list is definitely the Houston Rockets, just because they've been sort of on parallel tracks up until this season as far as rebuilding and, like Cade and Jalen Green had a little bit of a rivalry, and of course the franchises draft those guys, and now they draft Amen and Asar.
Yeah, the Thompson bros. Yeah.
The Thompson bros. And there's been a much bigger gap in those teams this season where Houston's like a lot more respectable and the Pistons haven't gotten to that point. So, I think the fervor from Detroit's standpoint has not been as strong this season just because you don't really have anything you can stand on as far as that, right? Because the other team has gotten so much better. But, I know that a lot of younger Pistons fans, especially, and I think younger Rockets fans too, they really are dialed into that rivalry just because of the places those two teams are in and, and the young guys that the fan base is coveted to different extents. Historically, I would say the Bulls always still have a little bit of an air to them when they play the Pistons, just going, obviously Michael Jordan and, the boys and whatnot. Like, I grew up, like my parents were Bad Boys fans and you always heard all the stories about just, the hate for Chicago and this and that. So that probably tops the list in my mind. I would put, it's probably more one-sided, right now, but I'll put the Lakers in that category again, just from like the historical standpoint. The Pistons beat the Lakers in 2004, and you had the sort of big market versus homegrown small market, vibes in that matchup. And obviously the Pistons pull off the upset. So there's still a lot of emotion toward the Lakers, I would say at this point. The list probably stops there. Like it's more so historical. And then also just, I think Pistons Rockets, which was generated largely by memes, to be honest, people bickering on social media, but like that still counts. But if I had to think of a fourth team, I really can't, just because there just hasn't been that type of competition for the Pistons. Cleveland was probably in that category at one point because of
LeBron.
Like those battles they had, in the mid to late 2000s. And
so the Celtics don't get mentioned. I know that there's the Isaiah Larry stuff from the 80s, and then you mentioned 2008, the last competitive Pistons playoff series was that conference finals, right?
I would say, I would put the Celtics, they're definitely up there. Maybe they're the fourth team. It's just that the Pistons and Celtics, outside of when they met in the Eastern Conference Finals in 2008, which obviously that was the Celtics championship year, so they kind of knocked out the last year of that core that the Pistons had with Chauncey and Rip and all those guys. Beyond that, in my lifetime, there have not really been any real Pistons Celtics battles that I can think of except that one. So I think from a historical standpoint, especially when I talk to older Pistons fans who were around for Larry and that era, they still sort of hold that in their hearts. But the Lakers got renewed because of 2004, and the Bulls are in the same division, so you're just playing a lot more. And the Celtics, just in recent history, have not really had those types of games. So I think historically they're probably still in that category, but there just hasn't been as much to fuel it as some of the other teams.
I know I'm keeping you long, but I have one last question, if it's okay. Because as a Pistons historian, the 04 team gets brought up so much when we talk to our fan base and we Knicks Film School people that are like, hey, remember the 04 Pistons? They didn't have a superstar. They did it with depth. They did it with teamwork. They did it with, and do you take pride in that? That people look at that team as the example every time you're clearly at a talent deficiency and you're going up against another team, but hey, we could be the 04 Pistons? Or is that at all disrespectful that team that's now going to end up with a bunch of Hall of Famers on it, they went out and won. That team should be respected. Well, it's a 6 straight conference finals. We should look at them in a different light,
No, I don't see it as disrespectful. Okay. I think for a lot of fans at the time, you had kids in Detroit, Michigan, wearing Ben Wallace afros at the time, and Ben Wallace was on the cover, I think, of 2K. I can't remember if it was 2K or NBA Live, but Ben Wallace had a level.
It was 2K. It was
2K.
You know what? I'm going to look that up because I had both. So
I'm pretty sure it was 2005. Like, I can't remember if it was Live or 2K. But that team sort of hit like a cult popularity that you don't see teams like that hit often, just for them to not necessarily have a true quote unquote superstar. Although you look back now and it's like, yeah, Ben Wallace is one of the greatest defensive players ever. And like all the guys they had in that group, like, Chauncey Rip, like you had a team for the two-way players, Tayshaun probably being a prototype of the type of wing that teams like now who could play make and knock down threes and whatnot. I think the way that the popularity of that team has endured, not just in Detroit, but like nationally as well, has been really cool to see. Just that fan bases continue to hold on to that 2004 Pistons team as like that beacon of hope that, their squad could pull off something similar. And I think with that, just the fact that type of upset has not really been pulled off since, I think has also kept the 04 Pistons sort of in the forefront of the like rings discussion and maybe setting expectations for certain teams. The biggest difference now is just that was just a completely different era of basketball. Like they were holding teams below 65 points a game. And that's just absolutely like, what's the equivalent now? Like you hold a team below, like if you hold 100. A team below like, 60 through midway through the third quarter, like that's a accomplishment now. So I don't know if you can necessarily replicate the way that team won now, just because the league, I think, is so much more deep and talented, and you just can't defend the way you used to back then. And teams are taking 43s a night. Like it's just, the math and geometry has changed so much that I don't know if you can replicate that. But just as a Detroiter, like I was 10 years old when they won that championship, and like I think that was the team that for people around my age, like that's the reason why you're a basketball fan, is because of that 2004 Pistons team. And like it's just been cool to see how they've endured. Like 2 decades later, like you still have fans like evoking them as the benchmark they want to get to. Like I think that's pretty cool, and I think it says a lot about that team's legacy.
I'll just personally say like that's the team that Knicks fans go to a lot. Like Jalen Brunson, like you said, is getting the respect this year and is taking a leap. But last year, the 04 Pistons got brought up a ton, especially the second half of the year after they traded for Josh Hart. And it's like, yeah, we don't have a superstar, whatever. Like 04 Pistons didn't have a superstar and they like won the title. Like, why can't you just have like a really good starting five with no weaknesses, right? Can't you have like a 9-man rotation that's better than anybody else's best 9? We then saw that the Miami Heat were going to be the thorn in everybody's side that year, which, unfortunately, I know Pistons fans don't have to worry about this at the moment, but it is very annoying to be afraid of a team that just takes 2/3 of the season off and is now like, oh yeah, we're in. Yeah, we'll come and be the boogeyman. It was 2K. It was 2005 to the NBA 2K because Carmelo Anthony was on the cover of NBA Live in 2005. So our instincts were right that it was 2K and not NBA Live. Both fun games, I will say. From shout out to my childhood. Yeah. So Omari, thank you so much for joining me on this. I know I kept you a little bit longer than I intended, but I really enjoyed our conversation. Before you get out of here, please let the fine folks at home know where they can find you and all your stuff.
No, I mean, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. You could find me on Twitter, just first and last name, Omari Sankofa. You can find my work at the Detroit Free Press, which is freep.com. And of course, me and Bryce Simon have our pod over at the Pistons Post. I'm just showing my hoodie real quick.
Hey, Pistons Post. Yeah. Bryce is good people.
Bryce is awesome. And we release episodes once a week, schedule dependent. I don't think we're going to drop till Wednesday this week, but we take a more analytical approach to breaking down the Pistons, and we have a lot of fun. So come join us over there if you have any interest in an 8-48 basketball team.
Listen, but solid analysis of a 8-48 basketball team. One of our X's and O's experts, maybe a month or so ago, he had been locked into the Pistons. I can't explain why, but he called them. He was saying like the Pistons could catch the Wizards, which they might actually. I think the Wizards are worse. Yeah. But he had been saying like he was singing the praises of the Wizards and of the Pistons, and the counter from his co-host at the time was like the counter is that they're 3-33. And he responded, well, it's a positive 3-33. And that's become a running joke that they're a positive 3-33. But lo and behold, Benji gets to be right because they're 5-14 since that 3-33 stretch. So they are actually a positive if you go from where they started or from where the other endpoint was. 8-48 at the moment. And I'm hoping.
So jokes on them, right? Like you're 3-33, and now you're
jokes on us. There you go. They're better. Going from historically bad to regular bad. It's steps forward, regardless of where the step came from. If it was completely off the staircase completely, it's a step forward. So
it's a step forward. Exactly.
Omari, thank you so much for joining me. And thank you everybody for tuning in to another edition of the Knicks Film School pregame show. We do this before every basketball game. So if you're joining for the first time, please remember to like and subscribe. If you're watching this on YouTube, at least like and subscribe. If you're listening on the podcast, please leave a 5-star rating and a review. I will be back tomorrow before the New Orleans Pelicans game to preview that game as well. But until next time, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Enjoy the game tonight, and I'll speak with you soon. Peace.